The news broke like thunder on a quiet evening, rattling timelines and television tickers alike, when it was confirmed that Danielle Spencer, the beloved actress who rose to fame as Dee Thomas on the iconic sitcom What's Happening, and had passed away at the age of 60 after a long and brutal battle with cancer, and almost instantly, the world seemed to pause, as if grappling with the loss of not just a woman, but an entire era of innocence, laughter, and resilience that she had embodied. And in that pause, the cameras caught what would become one of the most heartbreaking images in television history. Ernest Lee Thomas, her longtime co-star, sobbing uncontrollably on live television as he struggled to deliver a tribute to the woman he had loved like a sister, his shoulders shaking, his voice cracking, his grief so raw that millions watching at home felt their own tears flow in unison, because in that moment, he wasn't just Raj mourning Dee. He was every one of us mourning the loss of our childhoods, our families, our memories. Danielle's death was not just another celebrity obituary. It was a cultural wound, a reopening of a chapter that many had tucked away neatly as nostalgia, only to find that the people who made that nostalgia possible were mortal, were fragile, were fighting battles we could not see. And the cruel truth was that Danielle had been fighting nearly her entire life. In 1977, at the height of her fame, she survived a devastating car accident that left her with spinal injuries, injuries that haunted her for decades, resurfacing in the form of partial paralysis later in life. Yet even through the pain, she pressed forward, refusing to be defined solely by Hollywood or by tragedy, instead forging a new path as a veterinarian, dedicating herself to the healing of animals with the same compassion and wit that had made her famous on screen. This resilience, this ability to rise again and again, was what endeared her to millions. But it also made her passing all the more devastating, because if anyone seemed unbreakable, it was Danielle, and yet cancer, that ruthless equalizer, claimed her anyway, forcing the world to reckon with the fragility of even the strongest spirits. The tributes began to pour in, not just from fans, but from celebrities, co-stars, and people whose lives she had quietly touched outside of Hollywood, painting a portrait of a woman who had given more than she ever took, who had laughed even in pain, who had carried others' burdens while quietly enduring her own. Ernest Lee Thomas's grief became the centerpiece of this mourning, not because it was more important than anyone else's, but because it was so unfiltered, so unvarnished, so piercingly human. A reminder that the bond formed between those kids on What's Happening had been real, had endured, had matured into a lifelong family, and now that family had been torn apart. Clips of Danielle as Dee flooded social media, from her sarcastic one-liners to her sharp-eyed glances that always cut through Raj's schemes, reminding everyone of how she had been the comedic anchor of the show, the sibling every viewer related to, the one who grounded the sitcom's chaos with honesty and wit, and fans admitted openly that watching those reruns now would never feel the same, because every laugh would carry an undertone of loss. Journalists wrote about how Danielle had embodied the transition from child stardom to adult purpose in a way few managed, avoiding the pitfalls of scandal and destruction by choosing a quieter, nobler life. Yet that choice had meant she was often forgotten by an industry that thrives on noise, until her death forced that same industry to remember and reckon with what it had overlooked. Her passing was thus not just a tragedy, but an indictment, a reminder that Hollywood has a habit of discarding its brightest souls once the spotlight dims, only to praise them in death, and Danielle's story became emblematic of that cycle, sparking debates about how we honor the legacies of those who gave us so much joy in our formative years. Still, in the middle of these think pieces and tributes, the image of Ernest Lee Thomas remained the most powerful symbol of this loss. His tears echoing across screens as fans confessed that they too broke down watching him break down, that they too felt the unbearable weight of saying goodbye to someone who had seemed immortal in reruns, that they too had been forced to confront the passage of time, the loss of innocence, the erosion of the past. It wasn't just about Danielle anymore. It was about what she represented, the last tether to a time when life felt simpler, when laughter was easy, when television felt like family, and with her gone, that tether snapped, leaving millions adrift in grief and nostalgia. Yet even in death, Danielle gave one final gift, reminding the world of the value of resilience, of the beauty in choosing compassion over fame, of the dignity in living authentically. And so the weight of grief deepened into something the world had rarely seen so raw, because Danielle Spencer's story was no longer just about her as a child star who brought joy with every witty comeback on What's Happening, but rather about the full arc of a woman who fought quietly, yet ferociously against odds that would have broken many others. And the tragedy of her passing made those struggles resonate all the more, as if her battles had been leading to this moment of universal recognition and sorrow, a recognition that behind the sitcom laughter was a soul that bore pain, sacrifice, and resilience. And part 2 of this story must dig deeper into that legacy, into how her passing created ripples of memory, identity, and connection across generations. The news that she had died after her long fight with cancer continued to spread like wildfire, and while headlines summarized her as the little sister Dee, Thomas, fans and friends insisted on reminding the world that she had been so much more, that she had been a healer, a caretaker of animals, a beacon of authenticity in an industry that so often devoured its own. And Ernest Lee Thomas became the symbol of that truth, his tears embodying a grief too heavy for one man to bear, but shared by millions who understood what she meant to him, to them, to all who had grown up with her. Ernest's breakdown was replayed endlessly on television and social media, each time evoking comments from viewers saying they cried with him, they mourned with him, they felt as though a member of their own family had been taken. Because Danielle was not just a character on a screen, she was the sarcastic younger sibling people wished they had, the voice of reason in a sitcom chaos that reflected real life. And losing her meant losing a piece of their own past, their own childhood, their own comfort. Fans wrote messages about remembering running home after school to catch the reruns, about laughing at her sharp tongue, about her being the first girl on television who made them feel seen because she was unapologetically witty, strong, and clever. And now the thought that such a vibrant presence had endured decades of hidden pain only to be stolen by cancer at 60 was unbearable. Her funeral became a gathering not just of friends and family, but of cultural memory, with celebrities, fans, journalists, and even strangers who had once brought their pets to her veterinary practice filling the church, each person clutching onto some fragment of Danielle that they had carried into their own lives. The service overflowed with testimonies from former classmates who spoke about her kindness before fame, to colleagues in veterinary medicine who praised her brilliance and compassion, to Hollywood peers who admitted that her sharp wit and grounded presence had saved them during some of their darkest days in the industry. Ernest spoke again at the service, voice cracked and trembling, telling the story of their very first day on set, how nervous he had been, and how it was Danielle, just a little girl then, who had cracked a joke that eased his fears and made him feel at home. And from that moment on, he had known she was special, not just as an actress, but as a human being who could comfort with nothing more than her presence. The room erupted in tears as he described how she never once complained about her injuries from the 1977 car accident, even when the pain was obvious, how she laughed through rehearsals while hiding discomfort, how she taught everyone what true resilience looked like. And as his words echoed through the sanctuary, people realized that Danielle's life was not defined by her fame, but by her fight, not by her sitcom, but by her spirit, not by her early roles, but by the legacy she built brick by brick with compassion and courage. Tributes poured in from across the globe, from networks replaying old clips, to fans creating montages of her best moments, to veterinarians sharing stories of how she had gone above and beyond for animals others had given up on. And in these stories, the real Danielle Spencer came alive, not just the image of Dee Thomas, but the woman behind her, layered, complex, scarred, but endlessly giving. In the weeks following her death, documentaries were commissioned, interviews resurfaced, and her memoir, Through the Fire, Journal of a Child Star, began circulating widely again, with passages highlighted by grieving fans about her belief that she was still here for a reason, still part of a divine plan, even after so much loss. And those words became mantras for people enduring their own struggles, proof that even in death, she was still guiding, still comforting, still inspiring. Ernest continued to speak publicly about her, appearing on talk shows where he could barely get through interviews without breaking down, each appearance reigniting waves of mourning, but also waves of gratitude for the bond they had shared. But the story did not end with the tears on live television or the flood of tributes that trended across every corner of the internet, because what happened in the weeks following Danielle Spencer's passing took the grief of fans and co-stars and transformed it into something far larger, something that bordered on a movement, a communal reclamation of memory and legacy that proved her influence was not just nostalgic, but alive, powerful, and deeply necessary in a fractured culture. For suddenly across America, reruns of What's Happening spiked in ratings as families who hadn't sat together in years gathered around screens to revisit the laughter she had given them, and social media became an endless scroll of clips, memes, and heartfelt essays dissecting her humor, her timing, her resilience, her very essence, until it felt as though Danielle had been resurrected through digital memory, living on in the way fans reshared and reinterpreted her work. Yet at the same time, the undercurrent of sorrow remained heavy, especially for those who had known her intimately, with Ernest Lee Thomas revealing in a later interview that he had been unable to sleep for days, haunted by the feeling that he should have done more, called more, checked in more, that he should not have let time and distance dull the bond they had once shared, his guilt pouring out in an unguarded confession that broke viewers' hearts all over again, because his words echoed the guilt so many feel when someone they love dies. Regret for the calls not made, the words not said, the moments not cherished, and thus his grief became a mirror, reflecting the audience's own unspoken regrets, making Danielle's death not just a celebrity passing, but a personal loss for millions. The funeral itself was a spectacle of bittersweet reverence, with castmates, Hollywood peers, fans, and even some of her veterinary colleagues gathering to celebrate a life lived with dignity. And as Ernest stood to speak again, his voice trembling but steadier than before, he told stories that painted Danielle not only as a star or healer, but as a prankster, a confidant, a woman with fire in her spirit who could make you laugh even when you wanted to cry. And his words drew laughter through tears, because that was the duality of Danielle's gift. She could hold grief and joy in the same breath, and even in death she managed to do it again. Outside the church, fans gathered with candles and homemade posters, chanting her name, playing clips of her most iconic scenes on portable speakers, turning the sidewalk into a living vigil that spread across cities in days, from Los Angeles to New York to Chicago, where murals were painted overnight to honor her legacy, proving that her cultural imprint had never truly faded. It had just been waiting for the world to remember. Yet as the tributes grew, so too did the conversations around the darker truths of her life. The car accident that nearly ended her career, the years of physical pain she endured in silence, the quiet dignity with which she left Hollywood behind, and the cruel way the industry had all but ignored her until cancer forced a spotlight back onto her name. And in these conversations arose a new demand, that her story not be erased or reduced to a feel-good headline, but told honestly, with all its struggle and triumph intact, so that future generations could understand that behind every smile on television is a human being with battles unseen. Activists began calling for scholarships in her name, particularly for black women in both the arts and veterinary science, a reflection of Danielle's dual legacy, while fans launched petitions for streaming platforms to preserve What's Happening as a cultural treasure, ensuring that Dee Thomas would never disappear from public consciousness again. And through it all, Ernest Lee Thomas remained the anchor of this mourning, appearing at events, breaking down occasionally, but also finding strength in the way Danielle's passing had rekindled community, admitting in a late-night interview that he finally understood why her death had hit so hard. Because she was never just Dee, never just Danielle, never just a sitcom star or a doctor for animals. She was proof that you could reinvent yourself, that you could rise after tragedy, that you could live without bitterness, and that kind of proof was rare, precious, and worth mourning with the full force of one's soul. The weeks turned into months, yet the impact did not fade. Essays were published in academic journals analyzing her role in television history. Documentaries began production exploring both her fame and her quiet second career, and her name became synonymous with the idea of resilience in pop culture discourse, until eventually it felt as though Danielle Spencer had become larger in death than even she had been in life. her image a symbol not of loss, but of endurance, of authenticity, of the quiet power of living for more than applause.